So today we're going to talk about 2ACs, and feel free to ask questions as I go, or I'll leave some time at the end for questions on the whole. We're going to talk about some big picture macro level thoughts about the 2AC, and then we're going to talk about the 2AC on different types of arguments, and then we'll talk about actually giving the 2AC and some thoughts about how, as you're actually proceeding, you want to be thinking about things. So top level advice about the 2AC. 1, assess relative threats. All 1NC arguments are not created equal, which is to say, not all 1NC arguments can produce a viable 2NR that the neg can win on. So you want to be thinking about what arguments in the 1NC do produce a viable, winnable 2NR against your affirmative. So some examples: if there is not much case defense against your AF in the 1NC, that is a sign that they're probably not going for the status quo, that they are likely going for a counterplan or a critique because they have not, contested or sufficiently defended against the truth claims in the 1AC, which means that the status quo, again, is not a viable 2NR. So if there's not a lot of case defense, that's a sign that you should allocate relatively more time to counterplans and critiques, because that one of those is going to have to be in the 2NR. If they have a disad or a counterplan with no evidence specific to the affirmative, that's another kind of signal to you or flag that that is not a viable 2NR. If they read a T violation that doesn't apply to your AF, or that you very obviously meet, all of these are kind of signals that there's not a viable 2NR from that particular argument, and so you should spend less time there. The second component of assessing relative threats is knowing what the best strategies are against your affirmative and what is most likely to produce a win for the negative if they go for it in the 2NR. So this is, backwards from AF writing. From writing your affirmative what the best arguments are, what the most significant and largest threats are against your affirmative, and those are the strategies that should against which you want to allocate the most time in the 2AC. So on the whole, what you're doing is you're spending more time on larger threats and less time on arguments that are not likely to win if the negative goes for them. Beyond that, you want to allocate time as equitably as you can among the different arguments. So if you are, you have a 1C with like 5 off and you think they're all relatively equal strength, you want to devote roughly equal time to them. That will usually not be the case. And so you want to increase the amount of time that you're spending on the more threatening arguments and decrease the time that you're spending on less threatening arguments. Second big picture thing about the 2AC, and this is something that many of you probably know, but this is the back to basics lecture, so I wanted to cover it anyway. The order of arguments. So in general, my recommendation for the order in which you should cover arguments in the 2AC is as follows. Start with your case. So start with your advantages. If there are solvency arguments on a solvency page, everything that's in the 1AC, the pages that are pertinent to your F. That should be first in the 2AC. After you cover the case, you should answer any topicality arguments that are in the 1NC. After you've answered topicality arguments, I think that there's some flexibility here, but you want to generally answer counterplans and then critiques, or critiques and then counterplans. And we'll talk in a minute about the kind of logic behind this ordering, but generally, either counterplans then critiques or critiques then counterplans after topicality. And then finally, any disads that are in the 1NC can be on the bottom. Now, why do you think we go, the kind of big picture grand ordering of arguments in the 2AC looks like this? Does anyone have thoughts about why arguments are in this particular order? Like, why do we start with the case? So
I think it might be because you start with the case because it's the idea you're putting forth. You need to show that it's like the most important. And then you go on to topicality because like it's contesting your case. And then counterplans can be defensive, and critiques are also talking about like the assumptions of your case. And then like disads are sort of like separate from that, as they're like completely like offensive.
Good. I think that's basically right. So as Zoe says, your case is your offense, right? On the affirmative, the case that you have presented in the 1AC is your offense. We're going to talk more about offense and defense in a second. The T arguments are procedural arguments about whether the 1AC should have been presented in the first place. It's kind of a, if the negative wins a topicality argument, that's, we tend to know that that's a TKO for the affirmative. They're essentially saying this 1AC should never have been presented or read in the first place. So topicality is an absolute, it's a, proceed or don't proceed. And so you got to be sure to answer that next. Counterplans and critiques, as Zoe said. So counterplans are designed to solve the affirmative, and critiques interact with the affirmative in a similar way that are designed to, alternatives are designed to solve some portion of what the affirmative has said. And so those arguments directly interact with your 1AC, right? And so those come next because it is beating the arguments that deal with your 1AC, with your offense. And then disadds, as Zoe says, are, those are offense for the neg, right? This is where the neg has presented their offense. And those arguments matter, certainly, and you cannot drop them. And we'll talk about, making sure that you don't drop any crucial 1C arguments, but they are offensive arguments for the negative, whereas everything, the counterplans and disadds or counterplans and critiques are about dealing with your offense. So the 2AC order is based upon the idea of defending your offense and beating procedural arguments. So offense and defense, I want to just sidebar really quickly into those basic concepts because it is important for thinking about a bunch of things in the 2AC. Offense, I like to think of as reasons to vote for one side or the other, active reasons that the judge should vote for the AF or the neg. So for the AF, like I said, your offense is your case. It's your 1AC. You have presented a bunch of reasons to vote for the affirmative. And defense are reasons not to vote for the other side. So, a series of the majority of answers to either the affirmative or to the negatives disadds are defensive. They'll say this or true, various pieces or components of this argument are not true. And so you should not vote for the other side on the basis of this argument because we have presented reasons that the argument is incorrect. At the end of the debate, the judge is going to weigh or compare the offense between the AF and the negative and decide which is more important or relevant. And so defense plays a role in assessing what risk of each argument or each side's offense may come into play. And the other place that offense can occur, as you likely know, is turns, right? So link turns, internal link turns, or impact turns, which say the other side's offense is backwards, that the sum component of it is not only incorrect or not true, but is actively backwards. So if the 1AC says economic decline causes nuclear war and the negative says economic decline is good because it saves the environment, that is offense, that is a turn. So thinking about offense and defense matters because you want to be combining offense with defense in the 2AC. So you want to have your offense, which is the 1AC, and then you want to generate additional offense on various parts of the debate. And so we'll talk about some of the individual components and where you might be generating offense. But in general, the 2AC has to combine both offense and defense. Third kind of top level point I wanted to make is just the difference between on case and off case arguments for your treatment in the 2AC. And the big difference in my mind between on case and off case as it pertains to how you treat the 2AC is who sets the structure or the order of arguments in the debate, right? So for on case arguments, do you all know which speech sets the structure? Who sets the order of arguments for the debate on the on case arguments? The 1NC, good. So the 1NC is the, structure ordering speech for case arguments. What speech sets the order for off case arguments? This whole elective is about it. Yes, the 2AC. So the big difference between on-case and off-case arguments, besides who is generating offense and who is on the, attack, is where the order is coming from. And so it's very important to keep in mind that in the 2AC on case, you want to stick to the order that is presented in the 1NC. On the off case, you are setting the order for arguments. And so what goes along with that is that your arguments on the off case position should be in descending order of quality. Descending order of quality. So your best arguments should be first. The reasons, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that if you don't get to all your arguments, you've at least gotten out your best arguments. The second is that you want to put forward your best line of defense or attack against the off case positions. And so that requires knowing what are the various quality of each of the arguments is and going in that order. Fourth, and this blends a little into what I've just been saying, but the structure of 2EC blocks for off-case positions should use the following principles. First, number your arguments. So you'll hear me harp on this all the time. You'll hear lots of the other instructors at the DDI harp on this. Number arguments in the 2AC on off-case positions. Why do you all think that this is a worthwhile thing to do? Zoe.
It makes it easier for the judge to see what arguments you made. And so if they missed an argument, they could see that and all that stuff.
Absolutely. It's all about the judge, right? And hopefully you're beginning to think about the way in which debate is it's a communication persuasion activity oriented around getting a person in the back of the room or, the opposite side of the Zoom screen to vote for you. And a big component of getting them to vote for you is having them know exactly what your arguments are. And they will know what your arguments are if they know where they begin and end, right? And so numbers signal exactly when an argument begins and when it ends and when the next one begins. It also, as Zoe said, enables that, it means that if they think that they're flowing, they're doing great, and then all of a sudden you say 5 and they're like, oh, I didn't have a 4, they know that they've missed something and they're not going to tell you after the debate. It signals to them that there is something that they did not get, which does not absolve you of the need to explain the argument, but does mean that they cannot say I didn't know that this argument existed. It just means they know that they missed something. So number your arguments on the off case positions. Arguments in descending order of quality. We just talked about that. Third, combine analytical arguments with evidence and intersperse them with one another. So the argument, it should generally, as much as possible, go analytic card, analytic card, analytic card. You don't want to make all of your analytic arguments in a row, nor do you want to read all of your cards in a row and then have a bunch of analytics at the end. And this is for similar kind of pen time reasons as numbering, that it is really difficult to flow a lot of analytical arguments that are made in sequence with one another. It's just really hard to write everything down at the same time. And it is much easier if you are giving some pen time by reading cards in between your analytic arguments. The value of the analytical arguments themselves cannot really be overstated, that not all arguments require a piece of evidence, and many things that you say in the 2AC can be flaws with the negatives evidence. They can be objections to a claim made by the 1NC. They can be a fact about the world that does not require evidence. And so use analytical arguments and intersperse them among your cards. Let's see, what am I on? Fourth, make a diversity of different arguments in the 2AC. So it's really important that the 2AC on off-case positions include a set of different answers to the argument presented in the 1NC. So you don't want to read a series of cards on the same issue. In fact, I would say no more than one card per category of argument or type of argument that you're making in the 2AC. Maybe a couple if the 1NC is really long on, if it's a one-off critique debate, you might make a few different arguments that are of the same category. But for the general principle is as few as possible on a particular category of argument so that you're getting in diverse answers to each 1NC position. Next, I would have different modules and short and long versions for your 2AC blocks. So this has become even easier in the world of paperless than it was back in the dinosaur age when we all read things on paper, that you can have different 2AC modules to answer particular link arguments, particular impact arguments, particular types of, versions of the same counter plan. So let's say you rate a tribes affirmative, you want to have different modules to answer devolve authority to tribes as you do from consult the tribes. So use different, you don't want to think about your 2AC blocks as just, I have, one 2AC block to this DA or this counter plan. You have versions of the 2AC blocks that you can kind of pull from and mix and match based on the way that the argument is read and the particulars of how it's presented in that debate. And then I would also want to do short and long versions of 2AC blocks. So, sometimes with arguments like a critique or a disad, or, most of the possible arguments that the negative can present, there are versions of the 1NC that it's kind of obvious that they're not going for it. It's like a 30-second shell, and they don't have a link specific to your AF, etc. And that suggests that you don't, as we talked about earlier, you don't want to spend as much time on what is not as large of a threat to your affirmative. And so your block should account for that, and you should give yourself the ability to say, I'm only going to spend 45 seconds on this versus I'm going to spend a minute and a half on this. And your blocks should have a short version and a long version that account for those things. Last or fifth, I think, in whatever I'm doing a terrible substructuring job, do not model me in your substructuring. But this is my last kind of top level thing to think about. Time your 2AC blocks so that you know how long they take. Time your 2AC blocks. So once you've written them, time them. For bonus points, record yourself reading your 2AC blocks and flow them. And that will enable you to recognize what is difficult to flow, what is maybe not phrased ideally, what is inefficient, and give yourself feedback by taking the opposite perspective, taking the judge's perspective and flowing your own 2AC blocks. So that is a practice that I think that all 2As should get into, both timing and then flowing their own 2AC blocks. Okay, we're now going to talk about the 2AC on each type of argument. So first, 2ACs on case. My first tip here, and this is just kind of advice, write 2AC blocks for the case just the way you do for off-case positions. And this is especially useful, if you're relatively inexperienced, or if you're reading an AF for the first time, the AF is new to you. 2AC blocks on case will enable you to make arguments efficiently and spend less time kind of scrambling to flow exactly what you're going to say, or stumbling in your speech because you're not sure exactly how to answer the argument or what your best 1AC card is on that. If you have thought in advance about the arguments and written blocks, you'll give yourself the opportunity to do that better. So I would take, the top maybe 30 arguments that you hear against your 1AC and write case blocks to answer those arguments. And those should take the structure that we'll talk about in a minute in terms of how you're actually going about answering the arguments. And as you get more familiar with the arguments, you'll need the blocks less and less, and you won't have to rely on them. But I think they are useful to write even if you never actually read them, because they force you to follow ideal 2AC structure in the way that we're going to talk about, and gives you the opportunity to think through, what is my best part on this? How am I going to answer it, etc. Second thing that is kind of top level is be willing to kick parts of the case, especially if the 1NC is very large and you're under a lot of time pressure. So like you ideally might want everything that is in your 1AC to be present in the debate, but if the 1NC is really large, you got to be willing to jettison some parts of the case. And that can mean, oh, they have an advantage. We have an advantage that one of the counter plans definitely solves, or they have like a plank that we have no answers to solve this advantage. I'm going to kick that advantage. Or it can mean they have read like 4 pieces of impact defense to answer this impact. I don't think it is worth the time investment to answer each of these arguments. I'm just going to kick it. So be willing to jettison parts of the case for time reasons. Third, and very importantly, answer the arguments on case as they were presented in the order of the 1NC. So we've already gone over this. The 1NC sets the order for the rest of the debate. The 2AC must follow the order of arguments as given in the 1NC. The way to do this, or the way to approach it, is one of two things. Either reference the 1NC number, and that is my preferred kind of option. So 1NC1, 1NC2, 1NC3, and then answer the argument. We'll talk about what your answer looks like in a second. But first and preferred would be referencing the number of the argument made by the negative in the 1NC. Second, if the neg didn't number and you're not sure that you can stick to the numbering if it wasn't there, or if it's just your preference, you can use they say. So they say X. The thing with this is that you should use no more than 3 words to summarize the negative argument, because otherwise it is radically inefficient. So 3 words or less to summarize the negative argument. They say alt causes. They say no solvency. They say circumvention. They say no impact. Anything that is 3 words or less to summarize the argument is what you should use if you're using they say X. But, and then the but. What do you say to actually answer the arguments? Give each argument a short, punchy tag of about 3 to 5 words, and then the longer explanation. So summarize your argument or give it a headline or a tag in about 3 to 5 words. So we solve alt causes, or no circumvention, and then explain the argument. We solve alt causes, agriculture drives other sources of nitrogen runoff, or no circumvention, we fiat funding, enforcement, and oversight. So pay attention to those first 3 to 5 words, as that is what the judge is going to write down. So you want to, pay a good bit of attention to how you're structuring that 3 to 5 word summary. And you'll notice that each of the examples that I gave was a complete argument. It was like, we solve, well, it wasn't a complete argument because it doesn't have the warrant, but it was a complete summary. Yes, X, or no X, like yes, war, or no, I guess no circumvention I did say, but no impact defense, or no blah. The yes, no structure, I think, is kind of overused. And the reason that I don't like it very much is that the judge is writing down the first thing that you say. If I'm just writing down yes, war, that is not a complete argument. That is not the thorough, complete, warranted claim for the argument. It's just a blip, right? And so I would not use yes, no, X as much as possible, but a format that actually summarizes the argument. Next, reference specific 1AC evidence and do this at the end of your explanation or your answer to the argument. So absolutely invoke 1AC evidence and authors as you answer 1NC arguments. But I would not do that at the front where the judge is writing down the summary of the argument. Do it at the end so that they hear it while they're writing down the rest of the argument and can internalize it and flow it if they can. But it's the button at the end of what you're saying, not the headline. So use specific 1AC cards. Obviously, your 1AC should be, and we'll talk about this more in a second, but your 1AC should answer the majority of case arguments. You need to invoke which cards actually do that. And do it at the end of the argument. I think if you have multiple answers to a given 1NC argument, it is useful to subpoint them for the same reasons that we've talked about numbering arguments. You want to know, I don't just want a jumble of words on my flow. I want, okay, they've said that this argument, that this evidence is bad and that the 1AC answers it in this way, and they've said that it's wrong for this other reason. I want to know the individual reasons for an argument, that an argument is not true. Remember to extend the terminal impacts to each advantage. And this will usually happen when you're answering impact defense. And you'll note that I say to extend the terminal impacts, I'm saying to do it on the part of the line by line where it is most relevant. So answering impact defense. If there is not an answer to a given impact in the 1AC, that I think is an okay time to do it at the top or in an overview. But as a general rule, I would use 2AC overviews on case very sparingly, okay? And the overview should never be a summary of what is in the 1AC or in the advantage. Never, ever, ever should an overview in the 2AC be a summary of what was said in the 1AC. It should be, here's something in the 1NC that was dropped, or here is a framing issue that is going to influence how you evaluate this debate or evaluate the rest of these arguments. It should be advancing the cause of the affirmative rather than summarizing it, because the summaries, first of all, you have to give your judge some credit for knowing what you've said in the 1AC. Like, they were there, they flowed the 1AC, they get it. If you're just summarizing what you said in the 1AC, it's very inefficient and you're going to run out of time. I promise that it's going to cause you to drop something. So that was all a way of saying extend terminal impacts, but do it wherever the impact defense is, or if not, do it at the top. That's the one exception to no overviews rule. Next, avoid reading evidence to answer any defensive argument. Your 1AC needs to be good enough to answer all possible defense to the advantage. And if it's not good enough, you should replace your 1AC evidence or add things to your 1AC such that they can defeat the defensive arguments. So you should not be reading evidence in the 2AC to answer defense. I would only read cards in the 2AC on case to answer offense. So if they impact turn or meaningfully link turn the advantage, those are places that you can read cards, not on any defensive arguments. Questions about the 2AC on case before I move on to off case positions? Okay. 2AC on topicality. So this is, I'm going to go through the core arguments that you need in every 2AC on T. These are likely familiar to you, but worth a refresher. One, we meet. So a we meet argument says that the AF falls within the scope of the interpretation that the negative has read. The negative has presented an interpretation of words on the topic. A we meet argument says the AF is within the scope of this interpretation. And some people like to think of it as a no link argument. So if T isn't really a DA, but it sort of is, in the sense that it says the AF vision of the topic is a bad vision of the topic that would have detrimental impacts for what debate looks like. The we meet argument is the no link that says your violation is not something that applies to us. We fall within the scope of your interpretation. Second, counterinterpretation. So alternative ways to define the words that the negative has defined in their 1NC. And it's very important here when you're counterinterpreting to counter define all the words that the negative has defined. So if they define protection and water resources, you must counter define both protection and water resources. So your counter, to be complete, a counter interpretation should define each of the words that is defined by the negative in the 1NC. And very importantly, your AF must meet the counter interpretation that you identify. A very quick way to lose on T is to read a counter interpretation that your AF does not meet. So make sure that your AF falls within the scope of any counter interpretation that you read. Third, reasons to prefer your counter interpretation. So there's two components to the reasons to prefer your counter interpretation. One is offensive arguments for why your counter interpretation is good for debate, right? So that your counter interpretation is necessary for affirmative ground or flexibility, or it's necessary for the AF to beat the state's counter plan, or there's a clear bright line, or it's most predictable. Whatever the offensive arguments are for, here's why our interpretation is actively good for debate and should be prioritized above the negative interpretation. The second component here is defense to the negatives standards argument. So in the 1NC, they will say, here's our interpretation, here's the violation. Then they'll say, vote negative, and then they'll give some arguments. There'll usually be a limits-based argument and or a ground-based argument for why their interpretation is best for debate. And you want to answer give defensive arguments against the reasons that they have given to prefer their interpretation. So functional limits solve, their offense. The state's counter plan enables them to beat the majority of affirmatives. There's politics links, other kind of functional limits. There have to be solvency advocates. That's an example of a defensive argument. Or neg psi bias is another example of a defensive argument that the negative is structurally advantaged in debate. That's not true, but we can pretend. And any other kind of reasons that the negatives 1 and C standards are not true, or that you have defense to them. Finally, the fourth argument in the 2AC against a topicality violation would be reasonability. So reasonability says that competing interpretations is a poor frame for evaluation of T debates. So it says, you should not decide the debate if the negative has an interpretation that's a little bit better than the F interpretation. Rather, you should, if we have an interpretation of the topic, a vision for the topic that is reasonable, that allocates ground and sets a limit on the topic, that defines the parameters of the topic in a way that is debatable, that should be good enough. That's where you hear the phrase good is good enough. And reasonability is a very important component of FT debating. It can be kind of utilized or leveraged offensively in the sense that you are making an argument for why competing interpretations is a bad frame. It incentivizes the negative to go for T. It crowds out substance. It encourages the negative to raise the bar continually, just a little bit higher to limit out the F. So think about reasonability as one of your stock core answers to T in the 2AC. 2AC on counterclaims. So many of you may know the acronym for this, but it's one of my absolute favorite things in debate. I don't know why, but it makes me really happy. Postal. Postal is a summary of each of the types of arguments you can make against counterclaims. And this does not mean that you should go in this order, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but it does summarize all of the arguments. So perms, the P stands for perms. Permutations test the competitiveness of the counterplan, test whether the counterplan is mutually exclusive with the affirmative, and whether the counterplan is net beneficial to the affirmative. So there is a variety of types of permutations, but a legitimate permutation involves all of the plan and some or all of the counterplan text. So there's, you might say perm do both. You might say perm do the counterplan because the counterplan is a way that the plan could be done and it is not functionally or is not functionally different, or perhaps textually different from the plan text. You might perm to do any combination of the planks. If there's a bunch of different planks that the negative has presented, you might say perm do the plan and this plank to solve this net benefit. There's all kinds of permutation arguments, which is obviously a whole other lecture or elective for approaching permutation debating, but that is the number one, kind of way to approach counterplans. An argument that should be in the 2AC against counterplans is a set of permutations. The O stands for offense. And if I could reorder the letters in this acronym, I would put O at the bottom. We'll talk about why. O stands for offense against the counterplan. So an argument that the counterplan is actively bad or causes some negative impact. The reason I would put this at the bottom is that most counterplans these days, you'll hear conditionally. The negative will say the status quo is always an option, or the counterplan is conditional. So offense against the counterplan is, great, except that the negative can get out of it by just kicking the counterplan. So offense, great, shouldn't maybe be prioritized above these other things. Third, S stands for solvency deficits. So reasons the counterplan does not resolve the affirmative, does not deal with or sufficiently overcome the internal links identified by the affirmative. And solvency deficits ideally should be tied to a specific advantage or impact, or if your solvency deficit is, applies to the entire affirmative, that should be clear, like this, it doesn't solve certainty, and that is tied to specific impacts in the 1AC on both or all three or however many advantages. So solvency deficit should be tied to a specific aspect of the affirmative that you can clearly quantify. T stands for theory. So arguments that either the counterplan is theoretically illegitimate or that the status of the counterplan, the way it is presented, is theoretically illegitimate. So arguments that the counterplan is theoretically illegitimate tend to be pertain to some kind of, some way that the negative is utilizing fiat So 50 state fiat is bad, international fiat is bad, multi-actor fiat is bad. Theoretical objections to the actions taken by the counterplan that say, hey, the negative shouldn't get to do this. In addition, or if it's just like an advantage counterplan that like does some different action to solve the F impacts and doesn't seem theoretically suspect, we want to say that the status of the counterplan is theoretically illegitimate. And this can happen in the form of conditionality bad or dispositionality as bad. The 95+% of the time it'll be a conditionality is bad argument. And you want to say the conditionality is bad in every 2AC. Every single one, because the counterplan will be, as I said, read conditionally in almost all the debates that you have. So it's gonna apply almost no matter what. The other reasons to make this argument in every 2AC, the negative has to answer it. If they drop conditionality as bad, they're in a very bad spot. It also gives you an escape hatch or an eject button. If you say conditionality is bad and the rest of the debate is going horribly, the objection to the status of the counterplan is something that you can always go for at the end of the debate, even if everything else is just a total train wreck. So say conditionality is bad in every 2AC in which any alternative advocacy is presented, because it will always be conditional. I don't care what it takes to get you to do this, whether it's like every time you assemble a 2AC speech doc, you just automatically tilde in your conditionality bad block, whether it's a post-it note on your computer, whatever it takes to make sure that you say conditionality is bad in every 2AC. If you take away nothing else from this elective, it should be gotta say conditionality is bad in the 2AC. Back to postal. A stands for add-ons. So add-ons are new advantages to the AF that were not in the 1AC. And add-ons are most useful or at their prime kind of utility when it applies specifically to a counterplan, by which I mean it is something that the counterplan does not solve, right? So an add-on based on certainty against a process counterplan, or an add-on about why the federal government is key against the state's counterplan, or an add-on about why the US is key against an international counterplan. So it should be, an add-on should not just be a like generic additional reason that the AF is good. It's like another impact to the things you've already said in the 1AC, but should be an additional point of leverage against the counterplans that are read in the debate. And the other thing about add-ons is that they need to be pretty short to be effective. Well, not to be effective, but they should be pretty short to give yourself maximum time in the 2AC. So a couple of cards is kind of the ideal for an add-on. Finally, L in postal, links to the net benefit. This is an argument that the counterplan is not net beneficial because it also triggers the net benefit or doesn't avoid the disad that they have presented as being a net benefit to the counterplan. So if they have said that the state's counterplan avoids politics because it doesn't have the Federal Government Act, I would say all 50 states acting in coordination at the same time as per the counterplan definitely triggers the same effects. If they're right about solvency, triggers the same effects as doing it at the national level, causes fights in Congress if their link is true. So links to net benefit, you should not let the negative just assume because they said so that the counterplan avoids the disad that they've introduced, and many, many times it does not. So postal is the acronym for counterplans, really comprehensive, every single type of argument. I think in order, to return to our principle about order of quality of arguments, this will vary depending on the counterplan. Sometimes your best argument will be, this doesn't compete, here's a permutation. Sometimes it'll be, there's no net benefit. Sometimes it'll be, this really doesn't solve the case. So the order should, I wouldn't go in the postal order, but, do it according to what the best arguments are. 2AC on critiques. So this is a real sticky wicket for some people, but I think there's some basic arguments that you want to cover that generally deal with the critiques and give yourself some options. And the important thing to note here is that 2ACs on critiques will look fairly different depending on how your 1AC is written and on the critique itself, by which I mean some affirmatives are the way that they're constructed are designed to impact turn critiques. Others are designed to kind of go for a permutation no link strategy. And so the 2AC will, what the actual composition and makeup and, set of arguments are that you make will depend on how your 1AC is constructed and how it interacts with a set of critiques. But in general, you want to have all the following components. First is framework, which also goes by any number of other names, but an argument that boils down to the consequences of the affirmative must be considered in your decision making. So the consequences of the AF matter. We should, if the AF is a good idea, that should be compared to whether the alternative is a good idea and not just wished away or made irrelevant. And it'll, your framework argument will take a different form depending upon the critique and depending upon what your 1AC has said, but you want to get your foot in the door on weigh the affirmative against the critique. Second, permutations. So arguments that the 1AC and the alternative presented are compatible or can be endorsed simultaneously, that there is not a mutual exclusivity between the arguments made by the critique and the premises in the 1AC. These permutation arguments can be thought of in as there's lots of different ways of thinking about permutations. One function that permutations serve is as link defense or as link shield, to say that these link arguments might have some value, but a permutation overcomes them. So if you consider the 1AC and the alternative together, the assumptions are not incompatible, and the combination of those assumptions can overcome the problems identified by their link arguments. So permutations are kind of link shield arguments, in addition to they serve many, many other functions. And I like a permutation in the 2AC, at least one of the permutations that you make, to include the specific text of the alternative in the 1NC. So I would take the time to read the alternative text and to say, endorse the 1AC or do the AF and then read the actual text to the alternative presented by the 1NC. And I think this is useful because it forces you to actually think through, is there it triggers for the judge, this is compatible, these assumptions can be made simultaneously or can be endorsed simultaneously. It also forces you to identify where you need to win offense, because it will demonstrate the parts of the alternative or aspects of the alternative that actually are incompatible with the AF and indicate where do I need to win offense. So if the alternative to the critique rejects securitizing assumptions and you're like, great, do the F and reject securitizing assumptions, it tells you that you probably need to win offense on whatever securitizing assumptions you have made in the 1AC. So highlights where you need to win offense, demonstrates compatibility. I like to use the specific alternative text. Third kind of set of arguments you need to make on critiques is to answer the alternative both offensively and defensively. So you want to have offense against the alternative that says this alternative is actively bad in some way, that endorsing the set of assumptions made by the alternative causes some bad thing to happen, or is actively destructive in some way. So transitioning to a neo-socialist society causes transition wars, or endorsing a pessimist view of the world crushes pragmatism and political hope. Any offensive argument against the alternative is highly valuable and very important. You also want to have defense against the alternative that says the alternative doesn't solve. And there's two things you want to say the alternative doesn't solve. You want to say it doesn't solve its impacts. It doesn't solve these, sweeping set of claims that they've made about how the world operates. The alternative is not able to overcome all of the built-in, kind of structural issues that they've identified with how the world works. And second, it doesn't solve the 1AC. It doesn't solve the things that the AF has said matter. So you want to, preempt and beat the neg in advance on the alternative solves the case. You got to explain why it does not resolve the internal link arguments that you have made in the 1AC. Final argument that you got to make in the 2AC against critiques is answering the impact. So this can take a variety of forms, but in the same way that we'll talk about answering the impact to a DA, you want to answer the impact to a critique. A lot of the time, the arguments that you make here can be analytic, but they should in some form indicate that the set of impact arguments they've made is, comparatively not as big a deal as the impacts to the 1AC. They are can be minimized or solved by other things, or they're wrong about the structuring claim about the way the world works, etc. So got to answer the impact. That is my very brief primer on the 2AC against critiques. Finally, 2AC on DAs. Much like critiques, there's less of a one-size-fits-all solution to answering DSADs. In the 2AC, your set of answers will look very different depending on the F and depending on the DA. But I think it is really important to answer DSADs on every level, okay? So uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. I would have an argument that deals with each level of the DSAD in the 2AC. And some of those will be offensive and some of those will be defensive. So I would have offense against at least one component. Either the link argument is backwards, that the plan actually solves the thing that they say it causes. The impact argument is backwards. They say this thing is bad, but it's actually good. Or internal link, somewhere in the link chain between the link and the impact, they have it backwards. And we're going to go for an internal link term. That's probably the trickiest form of offense. Who can tell me what a complete link turn consists of? So if I want to link turn a DSAD in the 2AC, what components do I need for that argument? Good. So I need both arguments that say their uniqueness argument is backwards, that currently this thing is not going to happen. And then I need a link turn argument that says the link is backwards and we, actively prevent this thing, or we solve it, or otherwise the link is incorrect, not only incorrect, but reversed. What about a complete impact turn? Components of a complete impact turn. It's a little bit simpler. You just want, the uniqueness isn't relevant in the world of an impact turn, but what is relevant is there's no impact to the original thing that the neg has said, and the thing that the neg has said is actively the opposite, good or bad, so they have read an impact to their politics DA that says the infrastructure bill is key to solve climate change. You read, there's no climate impact to the bill, or there's no climate impact, but the bill kills competitiveness. Here's an impact to that. So you need a no impact argument and an impact turn. I'm going to skip over internal link turns because that's, a little bit tricky and fairly rare as offense goes, but I would have at least one of those. I would have either an impact turn or a link turn against every DSAD that exists so that you can generate offense. Yes, Zoe.
Could you maybe say an example of an internal link turn? I don't think I've ever seen one. I'm a little curious.
So an internal link turn, let's say that the neg introduces one of these industry DAs, and they're the plan, is regulatory, that kills the industry. Here's the impacts of the industry. So an internal link term would be regulation actually saves the industry, or regulation is good for the industry. That's the internal link between the link that says plan is, regulatory, impact that says regulation kills the industry. It's the connection between the two, and you say that's backwards. It's got a lot in common with a link turn, but is about the connection between the link and the impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So offense against at least one component of the DSAD, do not both link and impact turn. That is a double turn. Hopefully that makes sense without having to go into it too much. I want to quickly talk about a couple of other things. That's unless there are questions about the 2AC on DSADs or critiques, counterplans, T. I think I didn't pause after everyone. Okay. 2ACs in practice, a few important tips and ideas about how you're giving the 2AC. One, question from Guy. Should you answer every part of the DA if you're planning on going for a link term? Because if we read link/impact defense, can't they read that? I guess it's a great question. So this all depends on whether you want to straight turn the disad or not. So straight turn means that you've made arguments that only constitute offense with no defensive arguments, right? And so if you are like, I want to stick them with this disad, I am going to read non-unique and link terms. And that's it. I am not going to answer every level of the disad. I'm just going to read the components that comprise my offensive argument. I think you absolutely can do that. You just want to be, for the 2AC to do it, you want to be absolutely sure that you want to have a debate about that and that you want to stick the disad, the negative, with their side of the disad and have your side of it as well. More common, I think, in the 2AC is to make this diversity of arguments, which preserves the option for you later in the debate. If they extend the disad, you can decide in the 1AR, I'm just extending uniqueness in the link turn, not the defense. And that's straight turning again. But I think it's kind of your choice as to whether you are presenting a range of arguments to give yourself options, or if you're saying, I know I'm going for this link turn. I know this is our strategy against the DA and I want to stick them with it. So the upside to straight turning is like you're forcing the neg, you're kind of putting the neg off balance because you're forcing them to go for something that they've presented. The downside is that you're limiting your strategic options because you're also hemming yourself into, we are going for these link terms, right? Does that make sense? So you should be absolutely sure that that's what you want to go for if that's your strategy, but if it is, that's great. Yes, so.
This is a little off topic, but how do you use a counter plan to kick out of like the straight turn?
So that's a good question. It's a little bit complicated, but it depends on the counter plan and it depends on, whether it avoids the turn or not. So if the, negative reads an agent counter plan and they're like, this avoids politics because it doesn't go through the congressional process. And the neg is like, great, I'm going to straight turn politics and I'm going to say, non-unique and winners win. So winners win, meaning that legislative accomplishments build capital, increase the likelihood of passage of infrastructure or whatever. The negative there cannot use the counterplan to get out of the straight turn because the counterplan does not access winners win because it uses a different agent and the winners win is about legislative accomplishments. However, if the negative reads a counterplan that does a different action from the AF, but that equally uses legislation, that can also access winners win because it's like the legislative action of a counterplan also triggers the momentum to, pass infrastructure. So it accesses the same link or internal link argument as the straight turn, right? So it all just depends on the mechanics of what is the counterplan, what does it do, and what are the premises of the turn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Great question. Okay, so 2ACs in practice. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Start speaking at 75% of your maximum speed and then build up speed. So don't start speaking at top speed. Give the judge time to acclimate to your voice. Start a little bit slower and then build up speed. This is really important for getting the judge to flow the best that they can. Giving them time to acclimate to your speed is really good. Second, pay attention to time. So you know that you can't drop any off-case arguments in the 1NC. That requires paying attention to your time as the 1NC progresses. You need to be, as a result, you need to be making decisions as you're going. So if you've followed the advice from earlier in the elective and you've timed your 2AC blocks, you'll be in great shape because you'll know exactly how much time you have to answer everything and you'll be golden and you won't drop anything and it'll be awesome and all your blocks will be perfectly length. That really happens in practice. Most of the time, you're going to need to make decisions as you go along. And so that kind of harkens back to the reason that we are ordering our 2AC blocks in order of quality. So we're starting with our best arguments. So if you are running out of time, you can make your 3 best arguments on each page and move on and be a little less worried about, you know, I didn't get to 4 and 5, but that's okay because my best arguments are out there. The 2 other kind of, you know, micro decisions that you can make to keep moving and make sure that you get to everything in the 1NC, make arguments analytically without reading the card. So if the argument is tagged correctly, it'll have a claim and a warrant. You can read the card in the 1AR if you want to. Don't have to read the evidence in the 2AC necessarily. Make arguments analytically. And second, mark cards. I think if if you're running out of time, it is extremely valuable to mark cards as you go so that you get to more evidence. And I would say all things being equal, the make arguments analytically is very valuable. Getting more cards out is equally valuable, maybe more so. So get as many cards out as possible in combination with analytics to identify, to get out your best arguments. And you got to kind of continually be making those decisions as the 2AC happens. And so if you're able to get out the core components on each argument, that sets you up later in the debate to fill in, maybe you had to make an argument analytically, maybe you only got through half the card. You've set yourself up later in the debate to fill in the details, read the rest of the card, read additional evidence, do whatever you need to do, but make sure you get the core components on each off-case position out by marking cards, making arguments analytically. The last thing I wanted to cover is giving a 2AC on an argument that you've never heard before. So a new argument. This obviously looks different depending on what style of new argument it is, but my general advice is the following. First, take prep time to identify exactly what the negative is saying. So cannot overemphasize enough. You must take prep time if the negative has introduced an argument that you've not heard before. You've got to figure out exactly what it is in order to answer it properly. Second, use cross-ex and make logical analytic arguments to expose the flaws in the negative argument. So if you have not heard an argument before, there's probably a problem with it because you all are, you're at this camp, you're experienced enough that you'll have some idea the best arguments against your affirmative. And if you're getting something brand new, it's probably got a big problem or isn't very good. So use your, cross-ex and prep time to identify those problems, make those arguments in the 2AC. Add-ons can be really useful if there's like a new DA or a new counterplan. Hopefully the counterplan doesn't solve it. At the very least, get out an add-on to figure out if the counterplan solves it. Buy yourself some time. Again, conditionality is your fail-safe. So we've said that in the 2AC because that gives you an out if you've truly got no answer. So read add-ons. Be creative. This is a great example. If the negative reads something new in the 1NC that you've never heard before and you have no answers to, that's a great example of a time to use what Guy was asking about and straight turn something else. It's like, okay, we have no answer to this thing, but they've read a politics decide we're going to straight turn politics to force them to go for it because that leaves less time for the negative to exploit our lack of preparedness. And then, be creative and always integrate arguments that you do have. So if you have impact defense, if you have, alternative solvency arguments that are cross applicable, use the evidence that you do have, be creative and integrate as much as possible. Make as many arguments as you can against this new argument in the 2AC to give yourself, if you've got ink on the flow against a new argument, the 1AR can pick up the pieces, reorient the stuff that you've said and make it work once you've figured out the argument. Make as many arguments as possible in the 2AC to give the 1AR breathing room to do that. Okay, we're about at the end of time. Anyone have questions? Okay, if not, you all can go. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.